We're going to be looking at a number of religious answers to these questions, supernatural answers even beyond religion as well as some options for the more secular among us who might not find comfort in those kind of traditional answers. What we will find, however, is something that we found in secular humanistic Judaism more broadly over the last 60 years and even beyond, and that is that the questions that religion tries to answer are still questions that we, the less religious, need to answer, because they're questions that come out of the human condition and experience. And we face disasters since humanity existed, therefore we have to find ways to answer that challenge, even in a secular key. So that's the framing for this presentation. Hopefully you'll find it interesting, enlightening, and even a little inspiring. I want to start by taking you back to a part of the human experience that is in some ways emblematic of tragedy, the Holocaust. Primo Levi was an Italian chemist, not particularly a man of action or athletic ability. He volunteered for the Italian resistance, was a very poor resistance fighter, and was caught, was discovered to be Jewish, and was sent to Auschwitz. And shortly after his arrival there in February of 1944, he was cooped up in a barracks, and this episode takes place, which is described in his book, Survival in Auschwitz. Driven by thirst, I eyed a fine icicle outside the window within reach of my hand. I opened the window and broke off the icicle, but at once a large, heavy guard prowling outside brutally snatched it away. Warum? Why? I asked in my poor German. Hier ist kein Warum. Here there is no why, he replied, shoving me back inside. What a powerful demonstration of the inhumanity of that world. This is a world where I don't have to tell you why. There is no why for why you are suffering. That why question is a basic human question, especially facing tragedy. Why did this happen? If I know why it happened, maybe I can try to prevent it in the future, or at least if I know why it has to happen, it will help me accept the fact that it is happening. Even if the result isn't great for me, at least if it's reasonable or fair or just, no pain, no gain, I see something out of it, maybe I can accept it if I understand the why. But a place where there is no why feels empty. Now we have to remember that we're making a distinction between how something happens, how a tragedy happens, and why a tragedy happens. If there's a plane that crashes, there's a lot of how questions. Could have been pilot error, it could have been mechanical failure, it could have been terrorism, it could have been maintenance issues. Who knows what the problem was? We want to find out the how, and the how will help us prevent a future event in the future. But when we're talking about why questions, we're looking beyond just the mechanics of how it happened in a physical sense. The famous example of this why question comes from the Bible in the book of Job. The book of Job, which appears in the 3rd section of the Hebrew Bible, asks this question of what happens when a disaster, a tragedy happens that's beyond human understanding. In fact, the word Shoah, which is the Hebrew term for Holocaust, appears in the book of Job. That's where they derive the term for Holocaust in Israel. So in the book of Job, you have Job described as a righteous man, does everything right. He even atones for his kids when they do things wrong. He's that nice. And then God and Satan, who's sort of the prosecuting attorney at this point in his evolution, decide to test Job. And so they cause all of his children to be killed, all of his flocks to be destroyed, his house to be destroyed, and then eventually he himself to be afflicted in his body with sores and agony. And Job did nothing wrong. His friends come to him and say, well, you must have done something wrong. If God is doing this and God is just, then you must have done something wrong. And Job finally, his patience at an end, calls out to the clouds and says, he breaks me with a storm. He multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not allow me to catch my breath, but fills me with bitterness. If it is a matter of strength, he is mighty. If of justice, who says he will summon me? Who can send a subpoena to God or demand him to testify? Even though I am righteous, my own mouth will condemn me. I am blameless, Job says. And in the end, Job despairs. He says, it is all the same. Thus I say, he destroys blameless and wicked. If the scourge kills suddenly, unfortunately relevant these days, he will mock at the trial of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the face of the judges. If not he, then who is it? Why do terrible things happen to good people or people who just did nothing terribly wrong? This is the question we're going to grapple with today, that why question. We're going to look at three groups of whys in response to disaster. The first group I've called supernatural whys without monotheism, because people were asking this question long before there was only one God. So one example, if you recognize this picture, these are the Greek fates. The Greek fates would spin the string of an individual's life, the golden thread, so to speak. They had only one eye among the three of them. They were mostly blind. And so most of their decisions they made about the course of human life were not by your benefit or by your merit or by your sins. They were simply happening by fate without your intervention or ability to affect it. And when one of them decided to cut the thread, that was the end of your life, period. So any concept of fate, or even luck for that matter, if you really think of it as a cosmic force, is a supernatural intervention that affects your life, but it doesn't require a God to do it. It's nothing personal, it's just beyond your control. And there's really nothing you can do about it. If you ask why, the answer is, well, it was just fate. It's just the way it was meant to be. Que sera, sera. Or to use the passage in Ecclesiastes, which is one of the more philosophic books in the Hebrew Bible, for everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. If you want to sing turn, turn, turn at the lines, you can. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance. In the end, very important, a time to embrace, and today, a time to refrain from embracing. But the point of Ecclesiastes is, the sun rises, the sun sets, and it has nothing to do with you. And what will happen to you in your life, to some extent, may be already decided. It may be a matter of fate or luck or whatever else the universe has planned for you. That's one example of trying to answer why in a supernatural vein. Another example is using many supernatural beings. Now, it doesn't only have to be gods, of course. It could also be demons, which are sort of like anti-gods, or demigods. You have in Islamic culture something called jinn. Think of genies in our translation of it. Ghosts also are thought of being supernatural beings that might cause disaster to happen to you. Sprites, little magical beings, or even the accusation of witchcraft. There never have actually been witches, but there have certainly been witch hunts, and even before modern times, of course. And the reality is that was looking for a why. Why did my child have to die? Maybe it's because that witch put a curse on me because she doesn't like me. The how is she put a curse on me. The why is she didn't like me. You see, even in the Greek pantheon, with all the different gods that were present, gods of the sea and gods of the hearth and gods of love and gods, the messenger god and the war god and the sky god, there still was some kind of intent behind it. Even lightning had Zeus aiming it. It wasn't particularly just or fair. I mean, often the human beings were stuck in the middle between the conflicts of the gods, if you read the Iliad or the Odyssey or any of those Greek myths. The why is that they didn't like you and they committed tragedy on you, or they were fighting with each other and you got stuck in the middle like the ants trampled in a football game. It was also used, by the way, even in early Israelite culture to help explain why we won or lost in a particular war. This was very common in ancient Near Eastern mythology, to believe that if my country was fighting your country, then our gods were fighting each other at the same time. And therefore, you could explain a national victory or defeat in war as a result of the divine conflict. So, for example, in Exodus chapter 12, very appropriate as we're entering into Passover season, It's describing, in fact, the Passover episode, and it says very clearly in the Hebrew, "V'avarti be'eretz Mitzrayim," I will go through the land of Egypt, b'layla hazeh, on that night. "V'hikiti kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim," I will strike every firstborn in the land of Egypt, me'adam v'ad behema, from people and from the beasts. "Uvechol Elohei Mitzrayim e'eseh shvatim," and on all the gods of Egypt. It actually used the words gods, Elohei, like Elohim. On all the gods of Egypt, I will mete out judgments or punishments to them. So in this framing, it's not that there's one God who's causing the punishments to everybody, but it's in fact the God of the Israelites who is superior to all the other gods, including the gods of Egypt. Think as well of the episode where Moses turns his staff into a snake, and the other magicians of Egypt turn their staffs into snakes, but the snake staff of Moses swallows up all the other snake staffs of the magicians, thus representing the God of Egypt, the gods of Egypt being swallowed up by the God of Israel. Now, sometimes a staff snake is just a staff snake, but sometimes maybe it's not. And this also appears in Exodus chapter 15, the famous passage, "Mi kamocha ba'elim," who is like you among the, well, how you translate it is different. This translation has celestials, sometimes here among the mighty. But you might hear, if you hear the Hebrew, "Mi kamocha ba'elim," that word el, which again means the gods. So this is, again, a way of trying to explain national conflict. So if the Israelites lose, then maybe their God lost. But if they win, then their God won. And that way, again, you could explain tragedy using many gods. Another approach to explaining why, using some kind of supernatural system, is often given the phrase karma. This is a graphic depiction of it. You see someone pushing over a domino that winds up coming around to strike him. And the Greeks had this concept too when they talked about tragic irony. The imagery I had a professor in college give me was, if you shoot an arrow out and it goes out and boomerangs back and hits you, that's irony, that's dramatic irony, and that's to some extent how karma is thought to work as well. Now, I'm not talking about having a good reputation. You know, you do good things, you get to be known as being a good person, and it comes back to help you. That's not this kind of karma. I'm not talking about reciprocity, where I do something nice to you and then you're more inclined to do something nice to me. That's not this kind of karma. And I'm not even talking about the concept of paying it forward, where you do something nice for the person behind you in line and they do something nice for the person behind them, and it makes society nicer to each other. That's something you can track in a kind of tangible way. But karma, in its essence, or in its origin at least, had a very supernatural concept, that there was someone keeping score, or something, some entity, some aura out there keeping score of your good deeds and your bad deeds, and it promised some kind of fair reward and punishment system. So here we have a shift from the fate approach or from the multiple gods approach. Now we get the concept of justice. We want it to be fair. And if we want it to be fair, we want someone to be keeping score, so that if I do something good, I'll get rewarded, and if he does something bad, he'll get punished. Now, that doesn't always work in this life. So sometimes you have to think about karma in a transcendental way. And karma became very popular in systems that believed in reincarnation, because you could imagine that the next time around, you'd be rewarded or punished. So even if I'm a miserable untouchable living at the bottom of the caste system in India, if I'm a good person, maybe the next time I'll be incarnated at the next level up, or even to a Brahmin level at the top level of society. Now, karma does have a political function, because now you want to be as obedient as possible to the system, even if you're on the bottom. That works really well for the people on top, not so well for the people on the bottom. And so there was some political orientation to this concept of karma as well at one point. Nowadays, of course, it functions much more in the psychological realm of trying to explain either how something good happened to me, it must have been my good karma, or why something bad happened to me. Well, it must have been something I did that came back. Again, it's still believing there's some kind of just system. And it might even be part of this reincarnation system. Here's a depiction of a kind of Buddhist evolution from one level up to the next and up to the next. And one of the goals in that Buddhist approach to detachment was to, in fact, stop the cycle of reincarnation. After all, nirvana meant no longer having to come back to this world. Buddhism starts with what's called the Four Noble Truths. You have the concept that life is suffering. We all suffer. It's just part of what life is. Suffering most often comes from frustrated desire and attachment to things and to people. The way to eliminate suffering is through this eightfold path. And so you can find ways to detach yourself from the world, from attachments, from material things, even from other people sometimes. That's the whole monk-nun idea, even in a Buddhist context. And so that lets them disengage from the world and thus avoid suffering and tragedy in that way by not being reincarnated again. We forget that the Dalai Lama, for all his wonderful ethical statements and ethical involvement in the world, is thought to be the reincarnation of a great soul. I think he's the 11th or the 14th generation of a reincarnation of this great soul who has come back, the Bodhisattva who's come back to lead his people toward this in a nirvanish direction, at least. Okay, so these are all examples of supernatural whys without monotheism. Now we'll turn to a system with a monotheistic approach. Now, once you have one God and you have one source of power, one source of judgment, but unlike the faiths, this God is not only able to do everything and kill you whenever he wants, or many people, or no people, or save people. This God has other qualities too. Not only omnipotence, being able to do anything, but also omniscience, able to know everything, and omnibenevolent, which means always wants the best for you and for the universe. So it's not only powerful, not only knowledgeable, but also good. And that's where the dilemma of how can bad things happen if this God is all powerful, all knowing, and good, that's what we call theodicy in the philosophy of religion. So here's an example of a text from the Psalms that highlights the power of this God. Yahweh, that's the Hebrew God, usually written Yud-He-Vav-He, or pronounced traditionally Adonai, often in English Bibles translated as the Lord, all caps. That's what we translated here as Yahweh. Yahweh, you have searched me and you know me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. There is not a word on my tongue, but behold, you know it altogether. Search me, my God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there is any wicked way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. He knows the inner thoughts, and he can lead you to the correct path. And he cares about you. This is the famous 23rd Psalm. Yahweh is my shepherd, I shall lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. You are with me. You can do anything. You are in charge all the time. And you have goodness and loving kindness directed for me all the days of my life. So this is the benevolent side. One is the knowledge and power, and the other is the benevolence. Of course, once you have a God that can know everything and can do everything and always wants good for you, you're stuck with the dilemma articulated in Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? A disaster happened. A child died, an earthquake, a flood, a fire. How? Why? Okay, here we go with the why question. Why are you so far from helping me? And from the words of my groaning, I cry in the daytime, you don't answer. In the night season, I am not silent. And yet, our fathers trusted in you. They trusted and you delivered them. They cried to you and were delivered. They trusted in you and were not disappointed. So you have to, on one hand, articulate the grievance, the where are you, why won't you help me? And then come back and say, but you've delivered in the past, and I believe you'll deliver in the future. The power that might have allowed this to happen is also the power that you have to rely on to fix it. You see, in this system with a one God in charge of everything, the how is always because the one God allows it or causes it. And people will make distinctions between giving space for something to happen or causing somebody to have it. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. But this is the core question of theodicy. By the way, some of you may recognize that first line from Psalm 22. In the Aramaic translation, it was Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is what is attributed to Jesus on the cross as he is dying. So he's actually quoting the Psalms in Aramaic translation, even at that moment. So the classic answer for how bad things can happen to good people is that God created space. In mystical Jewish theology, there's a concept called tzimtzum, or contraction, where God creates space for the world to exist. If God is everywhere before the world, then he has to sort of almost like make a donut where there's a space in the middle for the world to exist. And the same is true with the concept of free will. If God did everything and intervened all the time, there would be no free will. We would be like trains on a track. There's nothing, no way to turn and nothing we can do, and we don't control our own speed. And so there's no judgment, and there's no consequence, and there's no responsibility, and there's no freedom. So if there is going to be free will, the argument is, then there must be a space created for people to do that, and sometimes they'll make bad choices. If God is going to reward and punish and enact justice, which is part of what a God is supposed to do, even Abraham asks before Sodom and Gomorrah, shall not the judge of all the universe do justice? Well, then people need a space for choice. Sometimes they make bad choices, and sometimes those bad choices will have consequences. So here at the very end of the Torah, the last book in Deuteronomy in chapter 30, we have a statement that very clearly articulates the options people have. Behold, says God through Moses, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and evil. For I command you today to love Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways and keep his commandments, his statutes and his ordinances, that you may live and multiply, and Yahweh your God will bless you in the land you go. But if your heart turns away and you will not hear, but are drawn away and worship other gods and serve them, I declare to you today you will surely perish. I call heaven and earth to witness against you. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. Therefore choose life that you may live. It's a simple deal. I gave you some rules. If you want to live, follow the rules. If you break the rules, you'll suffer and die. It's very simple. Make your choice. By the way, you might also notice that phrase choose life in political discourse finds its roots here in Deuteronomy chapter 30. So here in Job chapter 5, we get another example of this because Job's friends, after Job says, ugh, what a disaster this is, he starts to say, oh my gosh, what's happening? His friends come to him, as I said, and say, look, you must have done something. In chapter 5, behold, happy is the man whom God corrects. Therefore, do not despise the chastening of the Almighty. If you're suffering, maybe he's just correcting. It's like a spanking. It's to get you back on the right path. Now, you might have a different perspective on spanking today. But back then, the idea was spare the rod, spoil the child. If you're going to be corrected, it's in your interest to accept the correction and take the direction and move in the right way. And for he wounds and binds up. He injures and his hands make whole. He'll fix you as long as you admit you did something wrong. And they also ask the bigger picture question. Again, another one of his friends in chapter 8. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert righteousness? If your children have sinned against him, he delivered them into the hands of their disobedience. If you want to seek God diligently, make your supplication to the Almighty. If you were pure and upright, surely now he would awaken for you. So if you're suffering, you must have done something wrong. It's the only thing that makes sense. In traditional Jewish theology, God gave you all the rules, not just the 10 commandments that we read about in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. He actually gave you, according to Rabbinic Judaism, 613 commandments. 248 positive commandments you shall do, and 365 negative commandments of what you shall not do. Do not covet, do not steal, and so on, but also do not keep a worker's wages overnight, do not eat forbidden foods, and so on. Now, some of those commandments are kind of nebulous, like notice in Deuteronomy 30 again, I command you today to love Yahweh your God. What does it mean to love God? Have you loved him enough? Did you love him long enough, deep enough times during the day? And in other passages, it says love with all your heart and with all your soul. Well, you know what? If you have 613 commandments, and something bad happens to you, you could ask, well, did I break a commandment or not fulfill it as deeply as I could have? Odds are, with that many commandments, yes. So a system of free will with lots and lots of commandments actually is a way of helping to explain why bad things might happen. It must have been your fault. Now, there's a positive to this approach. The positive is that it gives an answer to most bad events that would happen, even if it means you have to blame yourself. And some people would rather accept a universe where they have to blame themselves than accept a universe where accidents happen. On the other hand, of course, we find that you have to explain terrible things by blaming the victims. So in the Mishnah section on Shabbat, on account of 3 transgressions, women die in childbirth. Because they're not careful in the laws of menstrual separation, nidah, because they're not careful with challah, separating the dough offering, and in hadlakat ner, in lighting the Shabbat candle. The fact they have to ask the question, why do women die in childbirth? And the answer is, it's their fault. Well, for some of us, that strikes us as really problematic. And then, of course, there's the fact that there are large-scale natural disasters that have nothing to do with free will at all. A tsunami, an earthquake, a plague. It's not a question of being a good person or a bad person or following ritual commandments. After all, we've seen some of the largest outbreaks of this virus have been in religious communities trying to talk to their God or assemble to pray to their God. And they're the ones that are suffering. And the other problem with free will, of course, is that sometimes other people suffer for your free will. If I abuse a child and then I get stricken with cancer, why did the child have to suffer? It's not just about me, it's also about them. And in reality, we see a lot of times that bad people get away with things for a long time. I mean, Dr. Joseph Mengele, the terrible doctor in Auschwitz, died in 1979, uncaught, untried. That's just not fair. So maybe another way to think about why in a monotheistic framework is what's called group responsibility or collective punishment. So it might not look like exact reward and punishment for the individual, but bad people that get away with it, it'll eventually come back to them. So one example is described here in Exodus, where God flies before Moses and compliments himself, saying, a merciful and gracious God, slow to anger, abundant in loving kindness. This is part of the traditional liturgy. The latter part is not, though. They end the quote in the liturgy, forgiving iniquity and disobedience and sin. But the part that's still in the verse that isn't quoted, and who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the children's children on the 3rd and 4th generation. It's intergenerational punishment. Now, we tend not to do that in our society, but we do know that sometimes the sins of one generation carry down. Think about child abuse and how that sometimes creates patterns that get replicated in future generations. It's nothing cosmic that we see, but we do see that pattern sometimes of negative behavior carrying down the generations. But this is an attempt cosmically to explain why, for example, King Josiah, who was a wonderful king, only lived for about 20 years and was killed. King Manasseh, who was a terrible king, ruled for 50 years. In the end, they say Manasseh did these terrible things, and so the punishment will come down to wipe out all of Judah and Jerusalem. As it says in the bottom of this first paragraph, I will bring such evil on Jerusalem and Judah, whoever hears of it, both his ears will tingle. I will stretch over Jerusalem the line of Samaria, the plumb line, the measuring line of Ahab's house. I will wipe Jerusalem as a man wipes a dish, wiping it and turning it upside down, empty. Manasseh died in his bed at an old age, but the kingdom will suffer, the people will suffer. And then Josiah was wonderful. There was no king like Josiah before him, did everything according to all the law of Moses. Notwithstanding, Yahweh didn't turn from the fierceness of his wrath because of all the provocation with which Manasseh had provoked him. And so it's an intergenerational punishment. Now, lest you think this is only in the Bible, this is still the explanation given in many Orthodox Jewish communities, certainly the ultra-Orthodox communities, for the Holocaust. That even if very Orthodox, Hasidic, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox communities were targeted by Nazis, the Einsatzgruppen going into Ukraine and Russia, nevertheless, it was their fault because they had sinned. They weren't pious enough, or they hadn't convinced their secular people to become more religious. there's all kinds of compensatory rationalization going on, but part of it is Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Vazeh. All of Israel is responsible one for the other, and that goes in a positive sense for community service and in a negative sense for responsibility and punishment. Now, there's a positive to this group responsibility side. It allows the system to claim to be just. And it does explain that paradox of how could Manasseh live so long and, well, it'll come back to get you. It's still fair. Of course, the minus is that what if you're the grandchild of this wicked person and you're suffering? That's not particularly fair to you. And after all, if this is an all-powerful God, does he have to stamp with a big foot like on an anthill? Couldn't he be more precise and pick people off for their individual sins? In fact, a later text after Exodus 34 explicitly says that one should not put a man to death for his father's or grandfather's sins. Each person should suffer for their own transgression. So that I think even changed within the time frame of the writing of the Hebrew Bible. Now, a third possible answer in a monotheistic system is using something called an afterlife. Even if this world is not fair, don't worry, it will all be made right in the next world, in heaven, or in Hebrew, Ha'olam Haba. Now, today, a lot of Jews think that Jews don't believe in an afterlife. But the actual truth is, historically, they did. They had a concept of an afterlife. They called it Ha'olam Haba, or Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. Gehenna was their word for the underworld. It's thought that this evolved during the period of the Maccabean persecution, where the more religious you were, the more you suffered. Whereas the Torah promised, the more religious you were, the more you'd be rewarded. And so maybe the way to compensate for that is to say, well, when it said you'll be rewarded, it meant you'll be rewarded in the next world, if not in this one. If you suffer now, you're burning off your sins for future judgment. And if you get away with evil now, you'll have to burn them off later in Gehenna. Now, this didn't always fly for some people. There's a famous rabbi named Elisha ben Avuya who became a heretic. He's also known as Acher, the other. And in a famous scene described in multiple sources, they asked, what did he see that made him go wrong? It said he was sitting and studying. He saw a man climb to the top of a palm tree on the Sabbath, take the mother bird and the young, and descend safely. This is violating the Torah command. At the end of Sabbath, he saw another man climb the same tree and take the young but let the mother go free. And as he came down, a snake bit him and he died. And Elisha said, where is the well-being of this man? Where is the prolonging of his life that it promises explicitly in the Torah with this exact law? Famously, in an apocryphal story about this, he said, Ein dayan ve'ein din. There is no judge and there is no justice. It's just not fair. Now, the Talmud and rabbinic literature writers add this passage. He was unaware how Rabbi Akiva had explained it, his colleague and contemporary. You will fare well means in the world to come, which is wholly good. Have a long life in the world with a length without end. So the way to solve the dilemma of injustice and tragedy in this world, the why, is it'll be made right in the afterlife. And other stories about Acher also explicitly say this. He's talking with his student, Rabbi Meir, in this passage from the Talmud in Chagigah 15a to b. Rabbi Akiva explained the verse like this. God creates the righteous and he creates the wicked. He creates the Garden of Eden and he creates Gehenna. Everyone has two portions, one in Eden and one in Gehenna. If he merits it by being righteous, he takes his portion and the portion of his wicked colleague in Gehenna, in Garden of Eden. If he's guilty, then he takes both portions in the underworld. So you have a chance to go either way, but you'll take the extra portion of those who wind up in the other place. But this is, he's quoting Rabbi Akiva as having taught this as part of mainstream Jewish theology. And then, according to this later story, when Acher died, the heavenly court declared he should not be judged nor brought into the world to come. He has to live in limbo because he studied Torah for many years and that merit protects him. But he also sinned, so he's not allowed into the world to come. And supposedly Rabbi Meir intervenes after he dies, and smoke arises from the grave, justifying the fact that Meir has allowed Acher to enter into afterlife. So an afterlife is part of Jewish theology, but it's one way to answer that question of why tragedy? Well, it gets made up later. Now, this has a plus as well. It's a 2-for-1 because it answers the human psychological need to deal with the fear of death, and it also deals with the question of cosmic justice. The downside is it still feels unfair. And after all, when you hear a child dying and someone says, well, God needed another angel, if there's a shortage and this had to be taken away. And to be honest, future compensation or reparations does not make the initial injustice fair. If there were reparations paid to African Americans, it wouldn't make slavery fair. It would be making up for something. So another option that's presented as a why in a monotheistic framework is that it's a test of faith. Ours is not to reason why. Job's initial response when he's suffering, he arose and tore his robe. This is in chapter 1. When his children have died, he worships. He says, naked I came out of my father's room, naked I will return there. Yahweh gave, Yahweh has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, as it's traditionally translated. In Jewish life, when you hear of a death, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the true judge. You hear in Islamic culture, it is the will of Allah. It's just the way God wants it. It's a test of our faith, and we have to believe. You think famously of the binding of Isaac story, where God tells Abraham, take your son, your only son, go sacrifice him. And Abraham says, tell me where. And off they go, and no questioning and no challenging, unlike some other stories. So that's one way to try to explain why is this tragedy happening. It's a test of my faith. Now, why the earthquake in Turkey has to test my faith, that's a different challenge. And finally, akin to this idea of a test of faith is the concept that it's not just a test of faith, but it's part of a greater good. God is teaching you a lesson even if you don't know why. You're learning compassion for other people who suffer as you go through suffering. So imagine you see a picture of a screaming child being held down by 3 men. Now, if you just see that, you think this is a terrible scene. But if you zoom out on the picture and you see another man is coming with a needle to immunize the child from a terrible disease, now you understand something about the picture. It's actually a good picture, even if the child doesn't see that it's part of a greater good. And so if you zoom out sometimes, you get a bigger picture. It's the answer that's given to Job by many of his friends. And even more importantly, it's the answer given to Job by God himself. When he finally does speak to Job out of the whirlwind, he says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who determines its measures if you know? What were its foundations fastened on? Who laid its cornerstone? Have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Tell me if you know it, he says at the end. So it's a question of who do you think you are, but it's also you just don't have the full picture here. Now, the book of Job itself ends with this kind of a statement, and Job says, you're right, who am I to talk? I'm ashes and dust. And then God gives him back more kids and more flocks and a new house. It's sort of atoning, but not really. Of course, in the end, we live in a world that is in what's called the Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it has an atmosphere, it's just right for us to live. And so maybe the fact that there are earthquakes, the fact that there are genetic diseases, the fact that there's undeserved suffering is part of a greater good that we just don't see. And that's part of that test of faith, but also part of a monotheistic approach to the question. Well, so these are some of those traditional answers. And you can see some of the kind of questions that even secular people need to answer, and even some hints of directions we might go. So maybe from the concept of the fates, we might understand that sometimes it's not about us, or there's nothing we can do to control it. We have to learn to accept what we can't control. But maybe there's also the concept of detachment from Buddhism, that we don't need to think that everything is the worst possible suffering there is. Maybe there are ways to be less attached to things and more focused on the big picture. Maybe there's also a way that we can do something to make the system just if it isn't just by lightning and earthquake and plague and disease. We have to act to bring that justice that we've seen articulated many times, whether it's karma or an afterlife or even intergenerational punishment or free will. These are all ways trying to say we want it to be fair. Well, so maybe that's a message to us that we need to make it fair. So here are some responses for the secular. And it starts with a change in focus. The traditional cosmology saw the world as the center of the universe. It's what I call the meocentric theory. It's traditionally called the geocentric theory. The geos, the earth at the middle. But the meocentric theory of the universe thinks everything revolves around me, revolves around us, revolves around people. And if we take a broader perspective, that we are simply a dot in the middle of the universe, here's the Milky Way with this little small spot saying where we are, stuff happens. There may not be a cosmic why. because we're just not that important in the cosmic scale of the entire universe. There's no personality behind who intervenes in the world. If you think that, well, in this cosmic scale, well, then if there's no personality making things happen, he doesn't write a Torah with rules. He doesn't care what you eat or who you love. He doesn't know if you're sleeping. He doesn't know if you're awake. He doesn't know if you've been bad or good. We're not suffering for sins. And so we don't have to add guilt to our suffering. But we still need to find some ways to answer that emotional need to respond to tragedy, even if we straddle the line between how and why in our answers. So here's one set of answers of how to respond. And it's what I call Stoicism and Strength. You face reality with courage. You can't control what happens, but you can try to control how you respond to what happens. So in Ecclesiastes, near the end of the book, after he's explored there's a time for every purpose approach, he's explored maybe I should be a righteous person approach, and he's finding that it's all vanity. Nothing makes a difference. And in the end, he says, all things, this is verse 2, all things alike come to all. There's one event to the righteous and to the wicked, to the good and the clean, the unclean, him who sacrifices, him who doesn't. As is the good, so is the sinner. There's an evil in all done under the sun. There is one event to all. We all die. For him who is joined with all the living, there is hope. A living dog is better than a dead lion. The living know they will die, but the dead don't know anything. Neither do they have any more a reward. Their memory is forgotten. Their love, their hatred, their envy perished long ago. So this life is what there is. And so go your way. Eat your bread with joy. Drink your wine with a merry heart. Let your garments be white. Live joyfully with the wife with whom you love. Again, patriarchal society. All the days of your life of vanity, which he's given you under the sun, your days of vanity, that is your portion in life. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might. For there is no work, nor plan, nor knowledge in Sheol, the underworld, where you are going. So do your best, enjoy this life as best you can. Now, this wasn't unique to Ecclesiastes. Elisha ben Avuya, that Rabbi Acher, was part of a phenomenon called Epicurus, the Epicurean strain even in Judaism. And Epicurus himself was a Greek philosopher who took a very similar approach. Have simple pleasures, enjoy them, and enjoy life while you're here, because this is what there is, and this is what we know. And so that approach of Stoicism, strength, we can endure and focus on the good, is one approach to how we approach tragedy. The second is to be realistic. We can affirm human feelings of tragedy and loss and not have to pretend it's part of something good and wonderful. When a child dies, it is terrible. It is a tragedy, and you should say so. Give people permission to be mad and sad and upset. And don't say, don't worry, it's part, you'll get over it. There's an angel in heaven. No, this stinks. For the rest of my life, this person is gone. Allow people to cry. I'm reminded of a scene in the premiere episode of 6 Feet Under about a family of undertakers where their father dies, and one of them wants to take dirt in a little, almost like a salt shaker, and pour it into the grave. And the other one says, no, death is messy. Get your hands dirty and do it yourself. There's something about that that's very realistic, you know. And also, of course, we're not on our own in doing this. You support other people as they're dealing with that tragedy in affirming their feelings. There's a wonderful line in the Talmud that says, the merit of visiting a house of mourning is in the silence that's observed. It's not about talking. It's not about the food trays. It's about being there and being present for the person. Create a space for that emotional expression and support other people. And if you need support yourself, ask for it. That's why we have friends and family. But they're not just for the good times, but for the bad times too. The third approach is more like the how than the why, but it's a pragmatism. What can I do now? How can I learn from this experience? How do I make the best of a bad situation? It's not saying God is teaching me a lesson or God doesn't give you something you can't handle. It's understanding that the reality is what it is, and now I have to see what I can do with this. Given the situation, what do I do next? How do I take the next step? How do I do better? And as one example, this is the wreckage from, I believe it was TWA Flight 800 that crashed off of Long Island. And this is the attempt to reconstruct the fuselage, the chairs, the equipment, the electronics, to try to find out what happened and why, and how can we avoid it going forward. It's more of a how question, but it's also answering the what do I do with this question? How do I fix this going forward? That was also part of the why question, the theological answers. The whole idea of the airplane's black box, which by the way I found out is not black, because that would make it hard to find. It's bright orange. So another interesting lesson. That started in the early 1960s. And plane flights have become so much safer now than they were then because of the knowledge acquired by these investigations after disasters. We might think even today, as we're living in isolation in our homes with our families doing only essential traveling, what can we learn? What can we become more aware of today that might change how we behave coming out of today? Maybe we're more aware of issues around healthcare access or working conditions or issues of imprisonment and confinement or issues of transnational human solidarity. We can use this experience for our benefit and growth. It doesn't have to be a cosmic planner who set this up as a kind of cruel pedagogy for which people had to die for us to learn something. We want to learn something out of people dying to make the best of it. And finally, there's always the option for hope. We can draw on the fact that over the last thousands, tens of thousands of years of human existence, we have dealt with tragedy again and again, and we've rebuilt afterwards. It happens over and over again. This is just one example of things we can do to have hope that it won't be as bad as it would be otherwise. Think about what season we're in right now. We're coming into Passover time. And before the year 70 of the Common Era, it was inconceivable to have a Passover celebration without animal sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem, at the one temple in Jerusalem. After the temple was destroyed, the Jews had to figure out, what are we going to do now? How can we rebuild? What do we do next? And they reinvented even what Passover was all about. The echoes had sort of the pre-echoes, the foreshadowing had happened even before, with the development of certain questions, the development of a ritual recitation of the story. We have the early prefiguration of the Haggadah happening even before the temple was destroyed. But after the temple is destroyed, now you have the emergence and growth of a new central institution called the synagogue, the house of study, and the house of prayer. You have the practice of fulfilling commandments instead of going to the temple for animal sacrifice. You have the practice of reciting shared language together, which we even do in a secular and humanistic Jewish setting. And you have the process of telling the story as a way to build hope, where if you can imagine having escaped from slavery to freedom, having surmounted the destruction of the temple to reinvent Judaism, now we too can imagine a time getting from virtual community to real community again on the other end of the tragedy we're facing today.